a first and a last for us today. He had you sit down, which was perfect, because sometimes I feel bad when I read verses right away to make you guys stand right back up. But you got to sit for a while now, not too long, but we're going to have you stand right back up. If you want to stand, we're going to read from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10. You can go ahead and put it up, Jenny. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. Amazing grace. So to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. That is why, for the sake of Christ, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Let's pray. God, I ask for your presence to fill this place this morning. Pray that you could speak to each person here, that this amazing grace that we're going to talk about would be something that we believe in, something that we trust in and rely on you for. And so I just pray that you would speak through me, that anything of me would be missed, ignored, not said, and that you could just be glorified this morning. In your name we pray. Amen. You may be seated. So this passage, specifically that last phrase, has been one of my favorites ever since I was a teenager. And I should say it before I get into this. I had actually been asked to preach or to share at a pastor's thing, was it beginning of last year? And beginning of 2023. And they had asked me to share on this passage. So I had started working on it, and then I think about a week before it got canceled. So even then, God was being gracious to me because he knew that a day was coming when life was going to be pretty busy and I would need a message. The more I thought about it and read through this one, tweaked it, the more it seemed to be really fitting for this time of where we're at as a family, where the church is at. So, but yeah. This passage has been a favorite of mine. Even over in Thailand, I had that last phrase stamped on dog tags that I would hang up in my vehicle when I moved back here, or had, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And back then, I didn't understand these verses the same way I do today. And I don't think I understand them. I didn't understand them correctly at that time, or the way they were meant to be. But it was still an encouragement to me. These verses are not an excuse for sin or to make mistakes, but how awesome is it to know that in our weaknesses, in trials, in difficult times, God's power becomes perfect and his strength is magnified. It's a pretty incredible statement for someone like me who doesn't feel like I have it all together pretty much all the time. And we see this displayed so many times throughout the Bible. God often uses people we don't usually expect, people with flaws, to fulfill his cause and his will. Even the disciples that Jesus chose just seemed like a group of people who could just fall apart at any moment. But Jesus saw past that, God saw past that, and just recognized those weaknesses as opportunities for him to be glorified. So before we go deeper into the text, we're going to look at the people that Paul was writing this letter to, the Corinthians. Because I think that when we understand his audience, this one specifically, it starts to make a little bit more sense about what he's talking about here. And also, if you go back to chapter 11 and start reading in there, you'll see he starts talking about this boasting thing. Boasting in strength, boasting in accomplishments. And he tells the Corinthians that he has so much he could boast about, but he refuses to boast about himself. So why this emphasis on boasting? Why does Paul talk about boasting in his weakness? Corinth was a part of Greece, and the people from ancient Greece were a very proud people. When we think of Greece, we might think of names like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. You might think of the large white marble statues or sculptures of muscular men and beautiful women. The people of Greece prided themselves in their smarts, strength, and beauty. They were driven to be strong, healthy, fit, and as physically and mentally perfect as they could be. And this drive resulted in the following historical accomplishments. The world's first device, labeled as an analog computer, was built over 2,000 years ago in Greece. Nothing as complex as that device, and I know it doesn't look like much, nothing as complex as that device was built again until the 13th century, over 1,000 years later. Men would show off their strength in competition, always trying to best each other. This resulted in the start of the Olympics, the race we call a marathon, and elite soldiers called Spartans. The Olympic Games were held every 4 years in the city of Olympia. The men would compete in a short race called a stadion, and eventually other competitions were added, like wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and the pentathlon, and obviously has continued to evolve into what we know of today. The word marathon was named after a city in Greece. A messenger ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory of the Battle of Marathon. According to the story, the messenger ran more than 40 kilometers. He did not train for this. He ran more than 40 kilometers, shared the message in Athens, and then died from exhaustion soon after. And to think that now people think it is fun to run marathons and spend hours and hours training to run them today. The Greek city of Sparta spared no expense when it came to creating the most elite military possible at the time. Boys were raised to focus all their energy on rigorous military training and physical development. These men would eventually become known as Spartan soldiers, who were considered the most elite soldiers of their day, as elite perhaps as America's Navy SEALs or the British Special Forces we have today. If these were the types of things that caused the people of Greece to be so proud of who they were proud not just as a country, but as also individuals. Their attitude of always trying to be the best drove some of them to extreme levels of perfection. In Sparta, where these soldiers came from, their desire to be physically perfect was so strong that it was common for newborns to be inspected, and if anything looked or was wrong with them, they would be abandoned and left to die. So based on all this info concerning the people of Greece, it's probably safe to assume that Corinth had some pride issues as well. So it begins to make sense why Paul is addressing this issue of boasting with them, and why he makes a big deal about committing to not boast about his accomplishments and instead to boast about his weaknesses. Now, we may look at some of these things and think that, well, those happened more recently. The Olympics officially started in 776 BC, plenty of time before Paul said these words. The Battle of Marathon, I think they say, was around 86 BC, and Spartan soldiers were before then as well. So this was a big deal to them. The Corinthians were a very proud people, and Paul is addressing this issue that he sees with them. Paul mentions a thorn that is present in his life, a weakness, something that is there to keep him from becoming proud and boasting about himself. Verse 7, so to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. What was the thorn? There's a bunch of speculation about what the thorn could have been or was. Some say that Paul may have been referring to his past when he persecuted Christians, and that reminder was a constant shame to him. Some think that maybe it was because of the people who were currently trying to persecute and kill him. Some say maybe it was a temptation, a recurring temptation that would surface. The most common belief is some type of physical ailment or disfiguration, maybe a speech impediment or something like that. But we don't know exactly why. But Paul references it here. Whatever it was a continual trial in his life. Paul's reference to this thorn actually translates to something much more significant than a thorn. Not to be gross, but instead of a thorn, imagine it more like a pointed stake used in persecution. It's actually closely translated to being crucified. His use of the word torment or buffet in some translations translates to being hit continually with a fist or a continual beating. So when we put it all together, we know that Paul faced an ongoing, excruciating trial or pain. And it was through this trial or pain that Satan attacked Paul again and again. Perhaps to some extent, we could identify with Paul today. Perhaps there's a thorn present in your life. Maybe it's a physical thorn. People face things like cancer, MS, or other chronic diseases or conditions. Perhaps an emotional thorn from the loss of a loved one. I can look across our audience today and think of many people who lost a loved one in recent years. Maybe it's an emotional thorn from a broken or abusive relationship. The thorn could be trials you face in your finances or in other areas of life. Or perhaps it is something spiritual. What is the purpose of the thorn? Why do we have to have the pain and the weakness? Paul said the purpose for him was to keep him from being conceited, from becoming proud about all that he had suffered and the revelations he had received. So to keep him humble, God allowed him to continue to suffer the thorn. Why do we experience thorns, pain, and weakness? The broad yet very simple answer is that we live in a fallen world. We can say that and we can write it off as that's what it is. Since man sinned, there has been suffering, there has been thorns. But the more specific answer for you, for me, isn't always known. We may not know the reason for ours, we may never know. But an important thing to remember is that just because we suffer doesn't mean that we've done something wrong, that we've sinned. There are people out there who will tell you that, well, you're bringing that on yourself because of something you did, and tell you to search out your life and figure out what you've messed up. The questions, what did I do to deserve this? Or what did I do that God would let this happen to me? Come too easily sometimes. Sure, there may be times when God disciplines us. But there are definitely other times when there's a different reason and purpose for the thorn. For example, Job's trials were not a consequence of something he had done wrong. In fact, it was because of how committed he was to God that God allowed Satan to afflict thorns on Job. In John 9, we read of a man who was born blind, and when Jesus was asked about the blindness and said, is this a consequence of this man's sin or his parents? Jesus responded, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God would be displayed in him. We may never understand the suffering that takes place in our world and in our personal lives, but it is important to remember as followers of Jesus that we need to continue to walk by faith in confidence that God never makes mistakes. And even when nothing makes sense, one day God will make it all come out the way he planned it. So then Paul has a plea that he talks about. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Even though we choose to walk in faith and trust God for whatever may be going on, our natural response will most likely be to pray for the removal of the thorn in our life. That's what Paul did, and there's nothing wrong with that. Paul pleaded with God to take away the thorn 3 times. Now, I don't know if this was an actual 3 times or if he meant this as 3 times is often used in the Bible to represent the idea of completion, that when he prayed about it until he received an answer from God, the idea of completion, that now he had an answer, now he didn't need to continue to pray about it. Either way, the number 3 is not an indicator for us today of how many times we're allowed to pray to God about a trial in our life. In Luke 18, Jesus tells a parable of a judge and a widow. The widow continued to pester the judge to give her justice. The judge refused over and over, but her pestering wore him down, and eventually he gave in to her requests. And in Luke 18:1, Jesus gave us the reason for that parable. He said that the parable was to express the need to continue to pray without losing heart. So when you feel that thorn pushing in further, when it hurts a little bit more, maybe it's a new thing, continue to pray. Pray again about it while continuing to be patient, awaiting God's response. And now we get into the really cool stuff. God responded, But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. God's answer to Paul's plea was no. Even though we know Paul is one of the most effective Christians and preachers that ever lived, God said no. It wasn't because Paul wasn't praying right. It wasn't because he wasn't using the right words. It wasn't because he wasn't living right. It was because leaving the thorn in place in Paul's life was ultimately for Paul's good and the glory of God. And this can be a hard thing to accept. Paul was exactly where God wanted him to be, doing exactly what God wanted him to do, but he still faced the thorn, and it was not going to go away. And even though God's answer wasn't what Paul wanted to hear, God made one of the most incredible promises to him. My grace is sufficient for you. God doesn't say no and then leave Paul to face his problems on his own. God promised to provide grace so Paul could handle the thorn. This promise 100% applies to you and I today. God's grace is sufficient for you. There's two things I want to look at that God's grace is sufficient for. The first one is God's grace is sufficient for salvation. In Ephesians 2:8-9, it says, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works so that no one can boast. God's grace is sufficient to save. It's sufficient to save someone regardless of how deep in sin a person might be, regardless of how long that person has been in bondage to sin. God's grace was sufficient for John Newton, a sailor who was an irreverent alcoholic slave trader. In 1748, John turned his life around, and God freed him from that bondage to sin. God's grace is sufficient. Newton became a different man after that, and the changes he experienced in his life led him to write the song, Amazing Grace. God's grace is sufficient for salvation. God's grace is also sufficient for the thorns, what we're talking about today. It's sufficient for the trials and the troubles that come our way. And while there will be times when we're delivered from the thorns, there's going to be times when, like Paul, we have to live with them for maybe an extended period of time, maybe for the rest of our life. Whether we are eventually delivered from the thorn or not, God's grace is available for each of us to face them. God didn't say, my grace was sufficient. He didn't say it will be sufficient. He used the present tense and said, it is sufficient. It is always available. It's always there. There will never be a time when you go to the spiritual ATM and request a grace withdrawal and it says insufficient funds. God's grace is sufficient for you. There is an abundant supply for you. So keep on making those withdrawals. There is sufficient grace in God's account. Hebrews 4:15-16, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who was tempted in every way that we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Matthew 7:11 says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks the door will be open. Which of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? So if you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? When we ask for grace, God is faithful to give it to us as we need. If our children ask us for something and we know it's good for them, we're probably going to give it to them. But on the other side, if they ask for something that we know won't be good for them, then we probably won't give it to them. If we know what is good for our kids, why is it sometimes so difficult to believe that God knows what is good for us? Maybe deliverance from the thorn, from the pain, from the trial, from the weakness isn't what is good for us. And that brings us to our last point, our perspective. Paul says, therefore, just been told no, says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. That is why, for the sake of Christ, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul's response to God's answer tells us all we need to know about his perspective. Remember Paul's audience? People who are pretty proud of what they've accomplished. They're pretty proud of perfection. Paul tells them that it is because of his thorn, his weakness, his imperfection, that Jesus' power becomes perfect. I keep having this thing come back to me, so I'm just going to say it. In the Sunday school this morning, I don't remember the verse. I'm probably going to mess it all up, but it said something about when you love one another, his love is perfected in us. Is that about what it said? And in our weakness, God's power is made perfect. I think it's just an indicator that God needs us for things to be perfect. Not to raise us up and now we boast about, well, God needs us. But it's through our love to one another that his love is perfected. And it's through our weakness that his power is perfected. That's not in my notes, so there you go. This is not the Corinthian perspective, to brag about weakness, to think that weakness is okay. That's not how they thought. That's not how they looked at life. While they boast in their strength, Paul says, I will boast in my weakness, because when I am weak, Christ is strong. In my weakness, Christ is powerful and glorified. Paul's perspective of his thorn as an avenue for God's power to be demonstrated in his life went beyond just the thorn. All right, so he acknowledges that the thorn is there for a purpose to better him. But then in this last verse, he goes further than that. He says that God's power could be demonstrated through his weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and difficulties. Paul's perspective was that no matter what happened to him or what it cost him, no matter what he must endure, he will happily endure it if that is what is necessary for Christ to be glorified. Unlike the Corinthians' drive to glorify themselves, Paul's drive was to glorify Christ. And unlike the Corinthians' delight in perfection, Paul delighted in the imperfections and the difficulties. And no, Paul didn't take pleasure in trials, in pain, or persecution. His delight was in the fact that those things were reminders of his dependence on God, and that through his weakness, God was able to do a powerful work. Paul delighted in seeing and experiencing God's power in his life, and that offset any suffering he had to endure. Another historical fact about the Corinthians specifically is that they were a sexually immoral people. They lived their lives to satisfy their lusts. And in studying for this message, I learned a new word, Corinthianize, which means to live a promiscuous life. The Corinthians lived to satisfy their desires. Paul showed them he was willing to lay aside his desires and trust that whatever God was working for Paul's good was for Paul's good and God's own glory. I wonder if our perspective is like Paul's. Are we willing to suffer for Christ's glory? Are we willing to endure the thorn, whatever it may be, and trust that God will work all things together for good, as Paul says in Romans 8? Charles Simeon said, though Satan may be the agent that inflicts the stroke, God is the kind friend that gives it. And though Satan intends us nothing but evil, God overrules it for our good. On the thorn, which were his brothers, he says this in Genesis 50, 19 to 20, I am in the place had the Paul perspective. Or how about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were all taken from their home to a foreign land, each of them committed to God no matter the cost. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we know, were tossed into a furnace for their commitment, and Daniel was tossed to a group of lions for dinner. Even though in the moments before they were tossed, they didn't understand why this was happening to them, their perspective was much like Paul's. They found their trust in God was not in vain, when two wicked kings acknowledged and honored God in front of the entire nation. Sometimes our thorns, as horrible as they may be for us, bring about something absolutely incredible. Something I came across a number of months ago said this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not spared. God wants to grow our faith and trust in him. And though we may not like it or understand why, the furnace, the lion's den, the thorn are some of the best times for our faith and trust in him to grow. Through those times, his power becomes perfect and he is glorified. And we could find story after story in the Bible, throughout history, of people who endured thorns in their commitment to God. People who were willing to suffer for God's glory and believe that through it all, God's grace is sufficient. And God's grace is sufficient for you and I today. Whatever the thorn is that you are facing today, whether it's a physical thorn. I wasn't going to do this, but Chris, you're here. I thought of you so many times and the physical thorn that you face. And I know it's not easy, but I just pray that Paul's perspective could fall afresh on you today. So whether it's a physical thorn, like a disease or a condition, God's grace is sufficient. Perhaps in its emotional thorn, like we mentioned earlier, the loss of a loved one, a broken or abusive relationship, God's grace is sufficient. Maybe it's a spiritual thorn, something in your past, something that you're facing now that's keeping you from fully following the path God has for you. God's grace is sufficient. Do you believe that today? Jesus made it possible for us as believers to approach the throne of grace with confidence and find all sufficient, amazing grace to help us face the thorns. God's grace is sufficient no matter the thorn. Earlier this week, I had a conversation with my dad, and he didn't know what I was sharing on. And I was just venting about how busy it all is. And he mentioned several times that God will give grace, God will give grace. And so, even though I'm preaching it to you this morning, like probably every single message I've preached in the last 4 years, doesn't mean that I have it all together. But I trust that in my weakness, God's power is made perfect. Let's have a word of prayer. God, I thank you for your amazing grace. It's hard to fathom sometimes what you're able to do with us when we just lay it all down. And I thank you for that. Thank you for that promise, that statement, that commitment that you've made, not just to Paul, but to each one of us. And so I pray for everyone here this morning who might be facing a thorn, whatever it may be, that you would give them grace today to face it. However long it lasts, that you would give them grace each and every day. I pray that we would trust and believe in that promise that you've given to us. Thank you for all that you do for us. Be with us as we go from here. I just pray that we would leave this